and welcome back to Feelings Matter, brought to you by Feelalytics. I'm Michelle Stinson Ross,
I am Tina Schweiger.
and we're going to get into some serious science nerd stuff today.
Yay.
After discussing a lot of emotional awareness, the basics of it, what it's like to be emotionally aware. Now we want to kind of drop into again the neuroscience. What actually goes on physically in our brains and our bodies, the biochemistry, a little bit of that. And I wanted to start this discussion off just generally by talking about the brain itself and the parts of the brain that are involved in decision making, all that kind of stuff. And I have the first screen to share for a change. How about that?
Yay.
I want a window. I want that window. I want to share this. So this is just a really high level, super basic understanding of kind of the parts of the brain that are involved in decision making and where emotion plays a role. So I want to start with the oldest part of our brain, the brainstem, that bit of instinct that plays a role in decision making, because everything that I've been reading, especially when we look at marketing decisions, how do we trigger somebody to make a decision to buy, that sort of thing. The reality is that impetus to take action actually starts in the oldest part of our brain with that instinct section and the fight, flight, or freeze. Do you want to talk about any of that, Tina?
That old part of the brain is the thing that drives your breathing, your things that you don't have to think about, your heartbeat. It controls all of those things. But you can imagine when you do get scared or angry, your heart rate is going to go up and your breathing is going to quicken. So it's very much involved at the most kind of primal level. I like to call that our lizard brain.
Mm-hmm. And then as that first little instinct to make a choice, make a decision, do something. When I'm talking about this in presentations for like marketers and stuff like that, I usually talk about, that impetus to make a decision about what we're going to eat for breakfast, what kind of coffee we're going to have, what we're going to wear today. There's that little bit of instinct that starts us on the path. But when we think about it, especially when we're talking about small little decisions like that passes through the limbic system where most of our emotional function lives. And absolutely, the choice of how I'm going to make my coffee, what I'm going to wear, those are emotional decisions. I choose what I want to wear based on how it makes me feel, how it might possibly make somebody else feel about the way I present myself, right? There's definitely a huge emotional component into the way we make decisions. And that happens in our limbic system.
Yeah, there's also the little amygdalas that are in there. They're the fight, flight, and freeze, the really strong emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've got the next slides that I will share. I'll dive into some of the more nuanced sections of that limbic system and how it relates to the logic part of your brain at the top. That's
Mm-hmm.
justify your decisions that you made.
Exactly. But that's exactly where I was going to go next. So we actually make our decisions based on those emotions, and then it processes through the prefrontal cortex, and we justify our decisions. We finalize and make ourselves feel like, yeah, that's the way I want to go. That's the right decision. All of that is done logically, kind of after we've actually made the decision.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's probably a good view of this brain. There's a lot that happens. And so we've been talking a lot about emotional awareness
Mm-hmm.
in our first episodes. And so we've been talking about things like, are you able to, in the moment, pay attention to the emotion that you're feeling? Are you able to kind of sense what's happening in your body when you feel these emotions? Are you able to sense what kind of emotions others are feeling, like empathy? And that is interestingly brings us to a new term that I've been discovering and actually been reading about in some major news outlets are starting to talk about this term called interoception.
Mm-hmm.
And I will share with you a lovely screen here. Are we seeing that?
I'm getting, there we go. Now I got it.
Awesome.
So this is covering my next basic question, which is how have scientific views of decision-making process changed in the last few decades? Prior to this concept of interoception, science had been separating that logic function from the emotion function and still considering human beings to be logical creatures. And the truth is that we're not thinking beings that feel, but feeling beings that think.
Exactly. That term is something that I think is pretty new. I've just started seeing it recently. If you think of terms like proprioception, that's like the perception of where your body is in space. And interoception is the perception of what's happening in your body. So the emotions that you are feeling, gotta turn off my notifications here. The emotions that you are feeling, can't do it right now. Okay, fun. So you're going to feel like, what are you experiencing emotionally? How are you making decisions? What are you conscious? What's going on inside your body? And that is interoception, which is kind of an interesting term.
Cool. Let's dive a little deeper into this.
Dive a little deeper into that. Let's do it.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me go to the next slide. So I have if you've ever studied neuroscience, even just casually or been interested in it, you've probably heard of Phineas P Gage.
I have.
Yeah, this guy from 1868. If you haven't heard of him, he had a railroad construction accident. He was building railroads in the 1860s, and an explosion happened. And one of the rods that he was using to do his job with went right through his brain. It wiped out the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, but it did in the prefrontal cortex, which is that like logic part of the brain that we were talking about, but it didn't impact his speech areas or his motor areas. And a lot of the areas where where he would process emotions were intact, but he ended up missing a huge chunk of his brain. I think even in the story, they say that like he coughs or sneezes or something and literally like ejects like, a teacup size full of brain, not a modern teacup, but a tiny old one, out of his nose or something. It's really disgusting.
Oh my goodness. I mean, well, just shocking the fact that this didn't kill him.
I know.
mean, a massive brain injury like this would normally be fatal.
Yeah, you can see it went up kind of under his cheekbone, right up behind his eyeballs. And you can see maybe one of his eyeballs didn't really fare so well. He's got kind of one eye missing there. But let's see how did this change this guy? He is the basis for quite a bit of our understanding and what happens in these parts of the brain.
Okay.
So let's go through and we're going to go back to interoception. I'm going to answer the question about Phineas P. Gage a little bit later after we've had a little bit of understanding. As you talked about in the beginning, our brainstem is the nucleus there. We have something called a solitary tract, a parabrachial nucleus, and there's all these words. There's a lot of big words, and I am not a neuroscientist, but I study emotions, so that is where I dive into this. Mm-hmm. But I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in all of those different brain parts. But all of them are there in the brainstem. And that brainstem it controls our cardiac function, our heart rates, our respiratory, our breathing rates, all of those things. The subcortical region, the area that's kind of just underneath the cortical region in that like limbic area, is where you can be conscious of sensations that are happening near your body, like touch, the sensation of temperature. I don't know if it's extremely hot where you are, but I feel this 109-degree temperature where we are, body position where you are, pain, vibration. And also that's the cortical region. The subcortical region is hunger and thirst and temperature regulation, sleep, memory, learning, emotion. So all of these things are bringing in information from your body into your brain. The brain is perceiving and bouncing around all of these signals that are coming in through the nervous system that goes throughout your entire body.
Okay.
So there's also so just to break this down into like less of the labels of the sections, but what the sections actually do and where they are. You have heart and breathing, at that brain stem back here, the occipital area, and inside that neck area. If you're kind of in that bottom area, like if you were to draw like a line behind your ears, that's your hunger and thirst and emotion and memory. A little bit above that is pain and touch. So that's kind of what's happening in those sections. And we can know that a lot from Phineas Gage and other studies. But the brain also then processes this stuff, and then it talks back to the body and tells the body what to do. So you have things like the orbitofrontal cortex is in the cortex, and that's where you start making some of the decisions that happen with the information that your body is pulling in.
Okay.
The cingulate cortex is part of the limbic system, and that's involved in emotion processing, learning, and memory. So a lot of that's where the particular part that's doing the emotion processing is. We have the ventromedial cortex, which is, if you remember, the part that Phineas Gage completely got destroyed. That's the part, a little foreshadowing, that is implicated in processing risk and fear. And the regulation of that amygdala, the fight, flight, or freeze, is happening in that ventromedial prefrontal cortex area. I'm starting to learn more about the insula, and if you read about interoception, consciousness happens in the insula. So you kind of think about that you exist, that you are conscious, that you are thinking, and the ability to reflect on that and be conscious is happening in the insula, very, very deep inside the brain. But that's also where we're perceiving and being aware of all the signals that are coming in from the brain, and then we're processing it and putting it back out into the body.
Very cool.
If we were to take out all the labels of what these are, you have an area for decision making, an area for risk and fear, an area for consciousness and emotion, an area for emotions, learning, and memory. So you think about if you are trying to make a decision, maybe you think back to a time in the past where you had a similar situation, where you had a similar feeling or a gut feeling. You're actually going around and around through all of these areas of your brain going, oh, there's a memory here. Was that scary or was that good? Then you're kind of going back and forth to try to bounce these things around and balance them to make a good decision with your emotions and your logic working together.
I'm so glad that you bring up the connection between memory and emotion, because that ability to emote, to have feelings, that's part of the process of being able to access memory, to store memory, that it's very, very closely tied to emotional experience.
Very much so. Yeah. I think there's plenty of studies that show if you have a memory or an emotionally charged situation, it's going to stick in your memory quite a bit more than just something that happens day to day. Back to school time. Can you imagine, I've got a kiddo about to start 6th grade, a whole new school, a whole new grade, a whole new set of friends. It's very emotionally charged. I bet you could think back and remember your first day of 6th grade. I mean, it's a very specific time. So when we have intense emotions, we tend to remember those things, and sometimes it can get a little distorted, but
right.
certainly.
Well, I also find it fascinating. So this is why storytelling and memory are also so important, because it is the process of telling a story where I relate something that's emotional. You, as the listener, connects to that emotional aspect of the story. And that is how it all gets stored, so that I can relate that story again, so that you can remember it to relate it to somebody else. That, again, this is why storytelling is so important, because of that emotional connection that allows us to store it away, keep it, and remember it later.
Yeah, definitely. So here's where this rod went through
Oh,
of this guy Phineas. So we basically blasted through what we would call risk and fear. We blasted through a lot of decision making, but not all of it. You know, some of it was still there, but we blasted through the emotions and the memories. So
mhm.
can you imagine living without that and what might happen? Well, Phineas lost his ability to process risk and fear. He lost his ability to regulate his emotions. His decision making capabilities, because he didn't have access to the emotion regulation and the memory of how previous decision impacted him emotionally. He didn't have the same level of decision making. If he's only using his logic brain, he's there. This really is what proves that we are emotional beings, making emotional decisions and then just sort of validating them with logic.
Mhm.
He lost his social inhibition. He was reported to have behaved inappropriately. I have a couple quotes on the next page. But he lost his social interaction skills, his moral judgment, his understanding of others' perspectives, empathy. He lost his ability to make judgments about what was socially appropriate behavior. And he lost self referential thought, meaning he lost the ability to think about himself and remember these experiences and then make future plans based on the things that he learned. So
Okay.
what did his friends say about him? Let's learn. So he started swearing a lot, and he was apparently like, this is the 1800s, so I loved the way that they spoke or wrote back then. He is fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest of profanities, which was not previously his custom. So he was a good guy, and all of a sudden he's swearing like a sailor.
Hmm.
He's not respecting his friends. He's impatient. A patient of restraint or advice when it conflicts with his desires, at times pertinaciously obstinate. Oh, I love these words. Yet capricious and vacillating, devising many plans of future operations which are no sooner arranged than they are abandoned in turn for others appearing more feasible. So we got a little bit like, oh, let's do this. No, let's do that. No, let's do this. Oh, I'm great. This is awesome. And expletive, expletive, expletive. He basically kind of reverted back to a child in his intellectual capacity, but he had the animal passions of a strong man. So he just lost his balance or the ability to speak between his intellectual faculties and his emotions was just destroyed. So there is the interestingness about Phineas P. Gage and what he learned about the brain and how decision making and emotions are so intricately tied when you
Uh,
just remove sections.
well, all right. This also fascinates me because you and I often talk about neurodivergence, whether we're dealing with emotional differences, mental health type stuff, as well as ADHD and people that are somewhere on the autism spectrum. And it's fascinating that, yes, there is a physical, neurological component to that, you know, our brains are just wired differently sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine some people's brains are wired pretty tightly and pretty closely, and they're very in touch with their emotions, and their emotions impact almost every decision, and they're conscious of it. And if you kind of start breaking apart those and maybe they don't connect and communicate quite as well, maybe you suffer a little bit and thinking of and maybe you're just too logical in the decisions or too emotional or maybe not considering the memory. And you can imagine pretty quickly how disruptions in the communications between those sections of the brain could dramatically impact your life and how you're perceived, how you perceive the world, and how your life really plays.
Right, right. I mean, it could be even little small things. So it's funny, as you were talking through that and some of the descriptions of his behavior, I'm like, this guy probably had serious object permanence disorder, right?
Yeah.
Like out of sight, out of mind,
Yes.
literally.
Yes.
And for most of us, something like that, it's a minor thing. We find ways to work around it and make sure that we don't just wander off and not do something that we started to do. We figure out ways to, support ourselves to get through that. But this just shows that this isn't, unfortunately, it is both true and untrue that this isn't just something in our heads, right? It's not something that we make up, or that it's just something that we can choose, decide to get over, but that there is something that is physical, neurological, that's going on in the way that our brain functions.
Well, you think about, like, some people are probably really closely intertwined, and you can get a thought in there and it gets stuck. You kind of imagine it, like on your wheels, like a little hamster.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of like worrying, right? You're allowing the same thought to go like through these cycles of like memory, emotion, logic, fear, memory, emotion, logic, fear.
True.
And you apply context to those sensations, and that thought that's going around through there, all of a sudden you're worrying. So if you think about, there's maybe a happy medium between, you're not Phineas Gage and like wiping out all of that part of the brain and just acting like an id, I guess, for lack of a better word. But you actually aren't too tied into the ego where you're, now we're into psychology, but you get into that like part where it's just worrying and just afraid and just processing, and, oh, what if this were to happen, and what if that were to happen, and I can recall this and I can recall that, and you can really work yourself up. So imagine that there is a happy medium between letting go and being engaged.
Certainly. So kind of in the big picture of this, when we think about emotions and decision making, and how can we engage that process. So now that we've got a better understanding of, oh, there is a neurological brain function thing going on there. How does this knowledge actually help us move forward and use this well?
It builds on what we were talking about being just aware of the bodily sensations that happen when you have emotions. Now think about maybe the components of the brain. Go back to that little hamster wheel and think, all right, is this thought sparking fear? Is this thought stuck in a loop? Should I let go of this thought? Should I give myself permission to let go of this thought, or let go of a worry? So maybe you can use it to trigger a memory of something that happened in the past and process that memory and keep going. You can just be aware of like, okay, well, my heart rate is elevated, my stress level is high, I must have some fear. And then think, oh, are there memories that go with that? Are there emotions that go with that? Are there, old patterns that maybe I'm stuck within that I'm not really aware? And then you can think about the insula, where part of that is consciousness. So we are gifted with the ability to be aware of what's happening inside our brain. And the more you can practice that, the better you will get at paying attention in the moment and striking that balance between letting go and letting things fully process.
Cool. I want to flip this on its head as well. So obviously we use these a lot for the regulation of negative emotion, but I want to remind people that the value and beauty of emotional awareness is also to help us be more aware of when we're experiencing something that's positive, right? So all of the self-help books out there that are geared toward creating more happiness in your life, I personally am of the opinion that we need to be more aware of the happiness that already exists, that sometimes we let it go right on by, and it's like, oh, this feels nice, but we kind of don't pay attention to it sometimes.
We're programmed to survive, and surviving involves a lot of avoiding things that are dangerous, that might kill you.
True.
Which takes over a lot of our brain. But we do have this gift of consciousness to go, hey, I would like to feel happier, I would like to feel more positive. Let me recall a time that I was happy, or let me recall a moment that I had really, you can use it, you can direct it. So I'm going to think about, oh, there was this time, I was so proud of my kid because they did this athletic thing or they did a drawing and it filled me with joy and pride
Mhm.
and I felt so good, or I was proud of myself for this thing, or I was really happy to, see somebody I haven't seen in a long time, and imagine how that felt at the time, and then revisit it, bring it up again, and like that can actually improve your moods, and it can actually uh, rebuild some neural pathways in a positive way.
Fantastic. And what about being aware of the physical experience in the moment? So, what things should we be like trying to pay attention to as far as just our physical experience of that happiness, that joy, that love? Obviously, we start to get into, the love chemicals and endorphins and things like that. But, I definitely want people to walk away with as many tools as we can give them in this moment.
Yeah. Focusing on a positive memory, focusing on a positive sensation in your body, and letting yourself sit for a moment and observe it. If you're excited and happy in the moment, you might notice, oh, I do feel like I have some endorphins going on in my brain. Oh, I'm gonna just sit and feel those for a minute and detach it from the context, but actually start just building the habit of feeling. How you can feel habits? You can build a habit of feeling happy. Yeah, I think you can.
I
Yeah.
think you can too.
Yeah.
Well, I think about those moments that I just can't stop smiling, right? That in that moment, there's something so good going on that it's actually doing something physically to my face. I start smiling. And just being aware of, oh my God, I'm smiling and I can't stop.
Or
This
what
is
are you?
good. This is something really good is happening that
Yeah.
I am just like lit up. That's an idea too. Is like pay attention to those moments where you physically feel lit up. What does that feel like to you?
It's got a name. It's the Duchenne smile. There's a name for it. And there's some studies that if you force yourself to smile, just do it. But with your whole face, your eyes and your cheeks and
Yeah,
everything, you actually will feel happier. Try it.
love it. So we pretty much covered like what are the parts of the brain involved in emotion and decision making, how have the views of that changed over time, and then how does the body engage with all of that signaling. Is there anything else you want to leave us with as we close, Tina?
Direct your hamster wheel. Let me know how it goes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time to discuss this. We're definitely going to go into a lot more about emotion and decision making over the next couple of weeks. And we hope to see you back here soon.